This is our interview with Gary Wood, who's a lecturer in syntax at the University of Sheffield. Okay. What's interesting about syntax?
Well, I think language is obviously a big part of what we do and who we are as human beings. And actually we know lots about language that's quite surprising. So the rules of language and the kind of rules that you need to know in order to be able to use and understand language are really quite complicated. And if you give somebody a sentence that's ungrammatical, for instance, and say to them, you know, what's wrong with the sentence? Well, they can tell you instantly that the sentence is ungrammatical, but actually the majority of speakers have not got any explicit idea about what the problem is there. And syntax is about trying to get to these underlying rules, to try and understand and model the kind of rules and structures that you must have in your mind in order to be able to understand and use language productively. So one interesting property of language is that it's infinite and it's creative. So you will hear sentences, in fact in this video I'll be using sentences that you've never heard before, and yet hopefully you're not having any trouble understanding what I'm saying to you. And that's because you're able to interpret the creative use of language. I'm able to create new sentences that I've never heard before because I don't just have a set of formulas for how to create sentences, but I have the underlying rules that let me construct new sentences and new phrases that you've never heard and I've never produced before. And what syntax is concerned with is trying to understand those rules and trying to make explicit the rules that we must have in order for language to be the way that we see and use language in our daily lives.
What research is important and going on in the world of syntax?
I mean, syntax is a very broad field, so there's lots of work going on looking at various different constructions. I think that there's lots of cross-linguistic work happening at the moment. So a lot of the early work in syntax was looking, because it was done in America and in the UK, was looking at English. And actually you can get so far by looking at English, but if you want to really understand what the deep and underlying rules of language are, that are maybe universal across all languages, then just looking at English isn't going to help. You need to look at a whole range of different languages and compare and contrast them in order to see what the underlying rules might be and to change the views that you might have formed on the basis of English. So, for instance, there are rules of language that people worked out in the 80s that are now being questioned on the basis of looking at other languages and comparing what happens in Chinese with what happens in English, for instance, and seeing how these differ from each other. A specific example of what's going on in syntax is a construction that I'm working on at the moment with a particular focus on children's language development, and it's a construction called sluicing. It's a fancy name, but basically it just refers to a situation where a question that's embedded inside a longer sentence gets elided. In other words, a part of it disappears. So an example would be, somebody said something, but I don't know who. So the who there is, the question would be who said something. But it would sound a bit odd if I went around saying things like, somebody said something, but I don't know who said something. Because the expectation is that I don't use more words than is necessary, and actually what I would say is, somebody said something, but I don't know who. And that seems like a relatively straightforward thing to do, is to just get rid of a few words at the end of a sentence. But actually understanding the rules that allow you to do that, and the conditions when you can do this and when you can't do it, is fairly complicated, and people have been working on this since the 1960s, and we still don't have a fully worked out representation of how this might work, and of the kind of knowledge that speakers must have in order to be able to produce and understand these kinds of constructions. So that's just one example amongst hundreds of thousands of things I could talk to you about the kinds of things that go on in syntax.
Mm-hmm. Why should students study syntax beyond first year?
I think people have various different reasons to want to go and study in syntax. So in our courses in Sheffield, syntax is a part of the core first year modules. And then some students decide that they're interested in syntax enough that they want to continue studying syntax in itself as they move through the rest of a degree programme. Other students decide that they're not so interested in these kind of formal structures, but actually are more interested in things like language use and language and society and socio-linguistic aspects of language. But I think regardless of which kind of area you want to go and work in, you need some way of representing and understanding the structures that we find in language. Having an opportunity to study and understand and have a system of representation of these structures, because syntax is not just about understanding the structures, but about having a way of representing them. So we draw some tree diagrams that represent the internal structure of sentences, and realise that sentences are not just strings of words like beads on a chain, but actually they have internal organisation, and different groups of words fit together into phrases, and then those phrases fit together into bigger units. And even if you want to go off and do something that's a bit more applied or socio-linguistic type work instead of studying structures formally, you need that system of representation, and you need to understand how to deconstruct a sentence and to understand its constituent parts in order to be able to do the kind of analysis that goes on in sociolinguistics, in applied linguistics, in discourse analysis, for instance. So I think it's a core skill that you need as a linguist, and it might be that you're interested in it and you want to continue studying it in and of itself. Lots of students do that, but equally it's important to have the skill to be able to apply it in other areas if you're working in different areas of linguistics as well.
Why is syntax important in linguistics as a whole?
Well, because in order to think about language and to think about the kind of the applications of language, why speakers use language in the ways that they do, how children acquire language, how it might be that you learn a language as a second language speaker, we need to understand what language is, what the object of study is here. So we need to have an understanding of not just the sounds of language and how we produce those sounds, but also of the way that words are constructed, the kind of rules that you know to form past tenses of verbs, for instance. But then beyond that, we need to know how to put those words together to form sentences. So whichever area or branch of linguistics you want to work in, you need an appreciation of the underlying structure of language and of the units that language uses and how those units fit together in order to be able to do the analysis that sociolinguists do, that people do in applied linguistics or in discourse analysis, and all of the areas of linguistics that people can look at on this website require an understanding of certain basic properties of the language, and one of those properties comes from studying syntax.